We went from the brain to the thyroid. I want to go back to the brain because obviously with your book, The Alzheimer's Antidote, really put you on the map as an expert on Alzheimer's disease and nutrition and this concept of type 3 diabetes. And when I was in med school, Alzheimer's was all about the plaques and the tangles. And once you had it, you had it. There was nothing you could do to prevent it. So you didn't even want to know if you were at risk for it, really, because there was nothing you can do. Now that paradigm is changing. So tell us, a little bit about how that paradigm's changed and what you think the main interventions are.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, it is still about the plaques and tangles, at least in the mainstream Alzheimer's and neurology world. It's changing very, very slowly. Yeah. There is more research coming out saying, look, this amyloid thing is wrong because there's been at least 4 pharmaceutical drug failures now of anti-amyloid drugs that have had they've either had no impact on the disease or they've actually made it worse.
Yeah, and they've been billion-dollar drug investigations.
One of the drug companies, I forget which one, even like they're waving the white flag. They've given up. They're not even going to try anymore. And I think this type 3 diabetes phrase is so telling. And it's all over the medical literature. And unfortunately, the people who need this information the most are not getting it. The patients and their loved ones and caregivers are never hearing that Alzheimer's is a brain fuel problem. It's a shortage of energy in the brain. So these neurons are atrophying, they're withering, they're shrinking. But I think it's still very, I wouldn't even say controversial. It's not even known at all, I think, in the conventional neurology world that we know as much about this as we do, or that there are these potential solutions. And I'm so careful. I was an English major in undergrad. I'm so careful with the way I say and write things. I use the word potential because we don't know for sure that you can prevent Alzheimer's or that you can, well, there's some small scale studies showing that you can reverse it, at least in its early stages. Someone who's very, very severely afflicted it's going to be a lot harder to have an impact in them, but I think it is reversible the earlier you catch it and the more mild it is. And I think we can prevent it, but I can't say for sure. I wish I could.
Yeah. Now, the concept, though, is there's plenty of glucose in the system. The brain has all the glucose it needs. It just can't use it efficiently. So sort of like an insulin resistance of the brain in a way. But again, there's that term. So is there an easier way to describe it for people to understand the mechanism a little better?
Yeah, so that phrase, water, water everywhere and not a drop to drink? Yeah. That's kind of how this is. You're exactly right. There's more than enough glucose in the body. Why isn't the brain using it? Yeah. And at first it is. There's a researcher, Stephen Cunnane, whose work is really phenomenal in this area of ketones for the brain. And, he was saying, is the problem one of supply or demand? Is that there's not enough glucose getting to the brain? Is the problem with the supply, or is the brain not using it? Is it the demand? And it's both, but at first it's the demand because the brain, for whatever reason, becomes unable to metabolize the glucose. There's plenty of glucose getting into the brain. The brain's just not using it. Then it becomes a supply problem because if the brain's not using it, the body stops sending it. Like, well, if you're not going to use it, I won't even give you any. So in the later stages, the brain doesn't even really take the glucose up in the first place. And I think, in my talk, I sort of speculate some of the reasons why I think this is happening. It could be just like the rest of the body, where the glucose is just not going to get used properly. It's just going to linger in the bloodstream. Maybe it lingers in the brain interstitial space and doesn't actually get into the cells. I think part of it, too, is, not to get too geeky, but the metabolism of glucose, the actual burning of glucose in mitochondria is more damaging than burning fats, more damaging than burning ketones. It's like the single most damaging thing in the body is the running of the electron transport chain. You generate these free radicals, blah, blah, blah. And because glucose is so much more damaging than those other fuels, and most of us have been burning almost nothing but glucose for our whole life, I mean, not nothing, but, predominantly glucose for most of our lives, these cells are already so highly damaged, and the brain doesn't have the same repair capacity that a lot of the rest of the body has. And I think if I anthropomorphize and try to put human ideas into these neurons, they're saying, I'm already so damaged, I'm already so debilitated from all these years of glucose toxicity that I'm not going to let you give me any more glucose. I'm going to shut the spigot off. I'm not going to take any up. I'm not going to metabolize it. I'm going to defend myself by just not even taking the glucose in. And we see that because the glucose is actually shunted toward other pathways that make protective compounds and regenerative compounds. And this would be no problem if there was an alternative fuel source coming in. If you can't use glucose, but you have, I don't know, like this crazy thing called ketones maybe instead, it's not as bad a problem. You might still have some fuel gap there, but not as much because you have some fuel. But most people are hyperinsulinemic all the time, or even if they're not hyperinsulinemic, they're just eating a lot of carbs all the time. They don't have the ketones, so there's no glucose and there's nothing else.
지난 영상에서 살펴본 것처럼 키토제닉 식단은 뇌기능 향상에 도움을 줄 수 있는 여러 메커니즘을 가지고 있습니다. 이러한 이유로 키토 식단이 알츠하이머 예방에 기여할 가능성은 충분하지만 이를 입증하기 위한 대규모 연구는 아직 부족한 상황입니다. 관련 연구 중 하나로는 캘리포니아 대학에서 진행된 쥐를 이용한 동물 실험이 있습니다. 이 연구에서는 케톤 체중 베타 하이드록시 부티레이트가 뇌의 시냅스 기능을 개선하여 초기 인지장애와 기억력 저하를 완화할 수 있다는 가능성을 보여주었습니다. 또한 뉴질랜드에서 26명의 환자들을 대상으로 12주간 진행한 소규모 임상 연구에서도 키토 식단이 초기 알츠하이머 환자의 인지 기능에 긍정적인 영향을 미쳤다는 결과를 제시했습니다. 하지만 이보다 키토 식단이 알츠하이머를 예방하는 강력한 도구가 될 수 있음을 보여주는 더 큰 단서는 혈당과 인슐린 저항성에 대한 연구들입니다. 키토를 포함한 모든 저탄수화물 식이요법은 혈당을 조절하는 데 가장 효과적인 방법 중 하나로 꼽히기 때문입니다. 예를 들어 영국에서 약 45만 명을 대상으로 진행된 대규모 코호트 연구에서는 당뇨병 환자의 당화혈색소 수치가 1% 증가할 때마다 치매 발병 위험이 8% 증가한다는 결과가 보고되었습니다. 또한 28개의 관찰 연구를 종합한 메타 분석 결과 당뇨병 환자는 모든 유형의 치매 위험이 73% 증가하고 알츠하이머병 위험은 56%, 혈관성 치매 위험은 무려 127%나 증가한다는 충격적인 데이터를 제시했습니다. 이러한 연구들은 높은 혈당이 뇌 건강에 치명적인 영향을 미칠 수 있음을 보여줍니다. 인터뷰의 주인공 에이미 버거가 알츠하이머를 제3형 당뇨병이라고 부르는 것도 절대 과한 표현은 아닌 것 같습니다.
So from a prevention standpoint, then, would you say we still need the ketones, or we just need to prevent the situation in the first place where the glucose is so high and the brain becomes resistant to it?
Yeah, thank you for asking, because this, I don't think everybody needs a ketogenic diet to potentially prevent Alzheimer's. What we do have to do is eat and live in a way that keeps blood glucose and insulin within a healthy, normal range. Some people are gonna need less than 50 grams of carbs or less than 30 grams of carbs to achieve that. Some people won't. And I really, if you look around the world, even historically, we have billions of people that age gracefully with all their cognitive faculties intact, and they're not on ketogenic diets.
Right.
It would be stupid for me to say that strawberries cause Alzheimer's disease or parsnips cause it's not the carbs per se. It's like all the confounding factors that come together to make this problem. So I think if somebody wants to be in ketosis all the time or be on a low-carb diet all the time as a potential preventive, I think that's great. But I don't think everybody has to. I think, like I said, that the thing is to control insulin and blood glucose. And it's not just the glucose. A B12 deficiency alone can cause cognitive impairment, choline deficiency, some of the fats. Long-term untreated hypothyroidism can cause cognitive impairment. So when I get someone that's coming to me for that reason, it's not just about the insulin. That's a big piece of it, but all this other stuff has to be looked at. And so I think how do you want to prevent Alzheimer's? Kind of the same way you want to prevent all the other stuff we talk, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. Keep yourself healthy, stay active, get some fresh air. I wish that we could quantify, because everyone, me included and you included, I do believe there's a role for healthy social relationships, for sunlight, for love in your life, but I don't know that anyone's able to actually quantify that.
Right.
What exactly does that do? How much of that do I need? And I kind of also hope we don't quantify. That's the kind of thing that shouldn't be quantified. Just go enjoy your life.
That's a great point, right? Because then you start counting your macros,
and then there's an app. How much social connection have I had this week? I'm like, no, that's not the point.
That's not the point, right? Oh, man.
How much does my husband love me?
Great point. Yeah, and I like that a lot. That's great. But going back real quick to what you said before, it's not the strawberries, it's not the parsnips. So part of it also has to do with where you're starting from, because if you already have diabetes, if you already have hyperinsulinemia, then yes, that big bowl of fruit, then that big bowl of root vegetables could be contributing to the problem, but it's because your metabolism is already broken at that point. Basically, you're already starting from a disease standpoint, whereas if you've reversed that, and you're not starting from that standpoint, then all of a sudden those parsnips and those strawberries aren't going to have the same effect.
Exactly. No, I totally agree. I think the type of intervention needed to reverse a disease once it's already in place is not necessarily the one you need to prevent it from happening in the first place.
Right.
And I use the analogy of an exterminator. If you have an insect infestation in your home, you call the exterminator, they set off this big toxic bug bomb, problem solved. That doesn't mean you needed them to come set that bug bomb off to prevent an infestation. What you could have done is keep food sealed, keep your windows closed, these lower level, safer things that would have prevented the problem from the first place. But no, you're exactly right. Once you're already in the disease process, desperate times call for desperate measures. Not that I call keto a desperate measure, but the more severe your problem is, the more strong an intervention you need.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Now,
이번 인터뷰에서는 정말 다양한 주제를 다루었는데요. 주인공 에이미 버거는 어떤 문제에 대해 명확한 답을 제시하기보다는 시청자들이 사고의 폭을 넓힐 수 있도록 돕고 있는 것 같습니다. 아, 이렇게도 생각해 볼 수 있겠구나. 내가 이 문제에 너무 집착해서 다른 중요한 측면을 놓치고 있었구나. 이런 식으로요. 사실 과학적인 데이터를 기반으로 더 정교하고 엄격하게 식단을 할수록 체중 감량이 잘 된다면 다이어트는 오히려 쉬울 것입니다. 하지만 실제로는 그렇게 한다고 해서 항상 좋은 결과가 보장되지는 않습니다. 이는 다이어트를 열심히 해본 분들이라면 한 번쯤 경험해 보셨을 겁니다. 얼마 전 마라톤 황영조 선수가 한 인터뷰에서 이런 이야기를 했습니다. 그는 스포츠 과학이 발달하고 환경도 크게 개선되었음에도 한국 마라톤 선수들의 성적이 30여 년 전 자신의 기록보다 한참 뒤처진 현실을 지적하며 과학적 분석과 데이터만으로는 선수를 더 잘 뛰게 할 수 없다고 말했습니다. 이 발언은 우리가 실천하는 식단에도 똑같이 적용되는 말인 것 같습니다. 물론 식단에서 과학적 데이터는 매우 중요합니다. 하지만 식단뿐 아니라 유전적 요인, 수면의 질, 스트레스 수준, 운동량 등 우리 몸 상태에 영향을 미치는 요소는 수도 없이 많은데 이 모든 것을 과학적으로 분석하고 수치화할 수는 없습니다. 결국 중요한 것은 완벽한 정답을 찾는 것이 아니라 지속 가능한 범위 내에서 약간의 절제와 균형, 그리고 방향인 것 같습니다. 에이미가 인터뷰에서 강조한 것도 바로 이런 부분입니다. 우리는 단순히 수치를 따지며 매크로나 데이터를 쫓는 것이 아니라 식단이 삶의 다른 영역들과 조화를 이루는 것도 중요합니다. 이어지는 인터뷰도 굉장히 흥미로운 주제인데요. 여기서도 에이미 버거의 유연하고 실용적인 태도를 엿볼 수 있습니다.
can we take a minute to talk about alcohol? You told me recently about this fascinating study that you read. And I know it's a little off topic of what we've been talking about, but we had an earlier podcast about alcohol and how it fits into a keto lifestyle or a low-carb lifestyle. Because let's face it, alcohol is very prevalent in our society, and it's a big part of people's social structure. And part of their life and their enjoyment. And the sort of the traditional teaching is that it shouldn't fit into a keto lifestyle because it's carbs, because it's sugar, because it can affect your liver, it can affect ketone production. You read some fascinating study that sort of said to the contrary. So just give us a little snippet about that study.
Yeah, this study was a little bit nuts because it was done in, I think it was 1970. So it was before, I assume that's before the IRBs, the review boards. And so you could kind of get away with doing some crazy things to people in an experimental setting that would never get approved today. They gave these subjects up to, it was about 46% of their calories from alcohol, from ethanol. And one subject even had up to 66%.
Wow.
And the remainder of the calories were either they had a cohort of a lower carb, higher fat, and a cohort of a higher carb, lower fat. And in both groups, the alcohol either did nothing to ketones barely, or it actually increased them. And it seemed to increase them more in the group that was on the higher fat, lower carb diet. And those people should have had ketones anyway. It's kind of a ketogenic diet they were on anyway, but the alcohol raised the ketones like well above and beyond what would have been just from the diet alone. I don't think that's not necessarily a reason to drink.
Right.
If you're looking for high ketones, increasing your alcohol intake would not be my first recommendation, but I do think alcohol can fit into a ketogenic lifestyle if you do it intelligently, and you drink the right things. I mean, beer is liquid bread, but there's some dry wines that are very low in carbs. Distilled spirits are zero carb. The problem with alcohol is what we add it to. It's the pineapple juice and the orange juice and the cranberry juice. And I think alcohol can fit, but it's not a weight loss tool. That's, if you're drinking, it's still liquid calories. Even if it's very low carb, it's not calorie free. So it can interfere if you're really struggling to lose body fat. But there's ways to incorporate it safely. And for most people, it doesn't lower the ketones. I think people need to be aware, and you probably addressed this if you had a show about alcohol. Alcohol hits people a lot harder and faster on keto. So like always be safe, be responsible. And the thing is, somebody tried to explain the full mechanism to me, and it's very complicated. I only understand a little bit about it, but because of the way that alcohol affects the liver and the way that the liver metabolizes alcohol, alcoholics actually sometimes have very, very freakishly low A1Cs. And it's because part of it is supposedly alcohol inhibits hepatic glucose output, gluconeogenesis. But I think there's other mechanisms involved too.
Yeah.
But if you want to lower your A1C, again, I would not, alcohol consumption is not the way that I would recommend you do it.
Right. Another example of the science and the mechanisms being interesting, but maybe confusing the issue more than they're actually helping the issue.
Yeah.
I agree. In the beginning, if someone's doing this to lose weight and to get into ketosis and improve their life, alcohol has very little role, if any. But once you've sort of hit that steady state, once you've had your success and you're wanting to, if that's part of your life you want to bring back, it certainly can have a role in the right way.
Yeah, it can fit. And one thing though is people have to just be careful because alcohol lowers inhibitions. And when you have a drink or two, you might be more inclined to eat something you wouldn't normally eat, especially if you're at a party or a restaurant where starches and sugars are literally within arm's reach. If you're drinking at home and that's just not even in your house, you don't have the option to eat it. But it is a slippery slope.
Yeah, its most detrimental effect is probably its effect on the brain and not its effect on the body.
Right.
Yeah.
저는 이 이야기를 들으며 한 보디빌더의 일화가 떠올랐습니다. 세계에서 가장 큰 보디빌딩 대회인 올림피아에서 8번의 우승을 차지한 로니 콜먼의 이야기인데요. 그는 프로대회 성적이 좋지 않았던 시절 시합 전날 스트레스와 긴장감으로 잠을 이루지 못하다가 선배 선수인 케빈 레브론의 방을 찾아갔다고 합니다. 당시 케빈 레브론은 대회에서 항상 로니보다 높은 순위를 차지하며 프로대회를 휩쓸던 선수였죠. 케빈은 긴장을 풀려며 로니에게 보드카를 한 잔 권했다고 하는데요. 처음에는 망설였지만 한두 잔 마시고 나니 기분이 좋아져 꽤 많은 양을 마시며 함께 즐거운 시간을 보냈다고 합니다. 결국 한참이 지나서야 숙소로 돌아갔다고 하죠. 그런데 놀랍게도 다음날 로니 콜먼은 처음으로 프로대회에서 선배 케빈 레브론을 이기고 우승을 차지합니다. 그는 이후로 승승장구하며 올림피아 최다 우승이라는 금자탑을 세우게 됩니다. 대회에서 항상 저조한 순위를 봤던 선수가 전날 독한 술을 잔뜩 마시고 다음날 보디빌딩 대회에서 우승을 차지했다는 게 정말 신기하지 않나요? 전문가들은 그것이 충분히 가능한 일이라고 분석합니다. 먼저 술을 마시며 긴장감과 스트레스를 줄여준 것이 단기적으로는 오히려 그의 몸에 긍정적으로 작용했을 수 있다고 하고요. 그리고 이것이 가장 중요한데 술로 인한 탈수 증상이 그의 근육을 더욱 도드라지게 만들었다는 겁니다. 하지만 이런 사례가 있다고 해서 아무도 근육을 키우기 위해서 술을 마시지는 않죠. 장기적으로 술이 신체와 근육에 해롭다는 것은 명확하기 때문입니다. 이 점은 케톤체와 술의 관계에서도 유사하게 적용될 수 있습니다. 인터뷰에서 언급된 연구를 확인해보니 실제로 음주가 간의 대사 과정을 통해 케톤체 생산을 촉진할 수 있다는 결과를 보여주었습니다. 알코올을 해독하는 과정에서 포도당 대사가 억제되며 간이 에너지원으로 케톤체를 더 많이 생산한다는 겁니다. 그러나 이 결과만으로 술이 체중 감량에 유익하다고 결론 지을 수는 없습니다. 이 연구는 음주 시 케톤체 상승이라는 한 측면만을 관찰한 결과일 뿐입니다. 우리는 술을 마시면 평소보다 식욕 절제가 어렵고 특히 여러 안주와 함께 술을 마시는 우리나라 음주 문화의 특성상 술이 다이어트에 방해가 된다는 건 길게 설명하지 않아도 여러분은 경험을 통해서 잘 알고 계실 거라 생각합니다. 어쨌든 모든 음식이 그렇듯 술 역시도 단지 좋다 혹은 나쁘다라고 쉽게 단정해서는 안 되는 것 같습니다. 술의 유해성에 대해서는 얼마든지 이야기할 수 있지만 한 잔의 술이 빡빡한 일상 속에서 긴장을 풀어주고 사람들과의 관계를 더 깊어지게 하며 긍정적인 변화를 가져오는 경우도 분명히 있습니다. 음식도 그렇습니다. 여러분이 키토식단을 한다고 해서 모든 음식을 그 기준으로만 바라볼 필요는 없습니다. 오히려 그런 엄격하고 극단적인 규칙은 언뜻 보면 효과적으로 보이지만 오히려 그것이 식단을 지속하지 못하게 만드는 원인이 될 수도 있습니다. 중요한 것은 먹는 양과 빈도수를 조절하면서 자신에게 맞는 방식을 찾는 것입니다. 술이나 좋아하는 음식을 완전히 끊으려 하기보다는 그로 인한 부작용을 최소화하면서 긍정적인 효과를 최대화할 수 있는 방법을 고민해보세요. 키토 식단은 절제가 필요하지만 그 절제가 지나쳐서 삶의 모든 즐거움을 다 잃어버려서는 안 됩니다.
Oh, wow. Well, this has been a really interesting tour on a number of different subjects, which you can speak very well on. And it's clear you've got a vast amount of experience and knowledge and can impart that knowledge in a way that's easy to understand. And that's why I love your series, Keto Without the Crazy, to really make it simple for people to understand.
Thanks. That's my whole goal is to uncomplicate it.
Yeah.